65 hours. That's how long the balloon flew. It was designed to fly for 30 days. 3 men launched, 0 survived. Their bodies weren't found for 33 years. July 11th, 1897. Virgo Hamna, Virgo Harbor on Danes Island in the northwest corner of Svalbard, closer to the North Pole than to any city in Europe. On this afternoon, the wind finally shifted south. After weeks of waiting, weeks of packing, of watching fog roll across the harbor, of journalists on support ships filing dispatches about nothing, a hydrogen balloon named Örnen, the Eagle, rose from a wooden hangar on the edge of the Arctic Ocean. 3 men stood in the gondola. Below them, the fjord glittered with that pale metallic light that only exists in the high Arctic in summer. Above them, nothing but sky, open, endless, indifferent. The men on the ground cheered. Cameras clicked. Notebooks filled with descriptions of triumph. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. What no one on those support ships understood, what the journalists didn't report, and the cheering public back in Stockholm couldn't have known, is that this expedition would not be decided by the Arctic. It would be decided by a number on a piece of paper. A hydrogen leakage rate, measured months earlier by the expedition's own meteorologist, reported directly to the expedition leader, documented, quantified, undeniable, and ignored. The balloon could not stay aloft long enough to reach the North Pole. The math said so. The leader's own scientist said so. The data was sitting on his desk. He launched anyway. This is not the story of 3 brave men defeated by the Arctic. This is the story of what happens when a man becomes so publicly committed to an idea that retreat becomes psychologically impossible, even when the mathematics of failure are sitting on his desk, even when the one person telling the truth has been removed from the room. By minute 8, you'll understand why the one person who could have stopped this expedition was replaced, not refuted, not overruled, but quietly replaced. By minute 12, you'll see the single decision that made death inevitable. And by the end, you'll know the answer to a question that has haunted this story for over a century. Did Salomon August Andrée believe his own plan, or did he know and go anyway? But first, you need to understand the world that built Andrée and the pressure that wouldn't let him stop. By the 1890s, the map of the Earth was nearly complete. The great continental interiors had been crossed. Africa had been carved up by European powers who drew borders with rulers and ink. The ocean routes connecting every major port had been charted, measured, and commercialized. The mountain ranges had been named, surveyed, and in many cases climbed. But the top of the world remained blank. The North Pole, 90 degrees north latitude, had never been reached by any human being, not by ship, not by sledge, not by any means available to the most powerful civilizations on the planet. The Arctic pack ice, a constantly shifting frozen ocean, hundreds of miles across, with no fixed landmarks, no paths, and no mercy, had defeated every attempt. Ships were crushed. Sledge teams turned back. Men died quietly in places no one would visit for decades. For the great powers of Europe, the pole was the last prize. Not because it held anything useful, there was no land there, no resources, no trade route, no strategic advantage of any kind, but because reaching it meant something that transcended practicality. It meant your nation, your science, your civilization was the one that conquered the unconquerable, the one that planted a flag where no flag had ever been. And for a small country like Sweden, a nation of fewer than 5 million people, wedged between the great empires of Europe, it meant everything. Sweden in the 1890s was a nation in a hurry. Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld had already given them the Northeast Passage, the first complete navigation of the Arctic Sea route from Europe to the Pacific. It was a triumph that put Swedish exploration on the map alongside the British and the Norwegians. Alfred Nobel's dynamite empire had made Swedish engineering synonymous with innovation and industrial power. King Oscar II, watching from the throne, saw scientific exploration not as idle curiosity, but as a tool of national prestige, proof that a small country could stand alongside giants. The pole was the next logical step, the next trophy, the next proof. And no one felt that pressure more than the engineers and scientists who moved through the corridors of Stockholm's Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. Men who believed, with absolute conviction, that Swedish rationality and Swedish technology could solve what brute physical force had not. Men like Salomon August Andrée. Andrée wasn't an explorer, he was an engineer, and his plan wasn't to sledge across the ice or sail through it. His plan was to fly over it entirely. Here's why that mattered, and why it was already doomed before it began. 1 year before Andrée launched, a Norwegian named Fridtjof Nansen had returned from the Arctic as the most celebrated explorer alive. Nansen's approach was the opposite of everything Andrée believed in. In 1893, Nansen had deliberately frozen his ship, the Fram, into the Arctic pack ice north of Siberia, and then he did something extraordinary. He waited. He let the natural drift of the ice, the slow, relentless current that pushes the frozen ocean from east to west across the top of the world, carry his ship toward the pole. When the drift path fell short, Nansen didn't force the issue with technology. He left the ship on skis. He took one companion and a team of dog sledges, and they walked. They reached 86 degrees, 14 minutes north, a new record, farther north than any human being had ever stood. And then he did something that Andrée would never have considered. He turned back. He turned back because the conditions demanded it. He turned back because the data said the pole was still too far. He turned back because Nansen understood something fundamental about the Arctic. It is stronger than you. Work with it or die. He survived. All his crew survived. He returned to Norway as the most famous man in Scandinavia. To Andrée, sitting in Stockholm, watching a Norwegian claim the world's admiration, this approach was primitive, slow, undignified. Nansen had spent 3 full years of his life, frozen in the ice, and he had still fallen short of the pole. Andrée believed he could reach it in 3 days. All he needed was a balloon. One approach would succeed. One would kill everyone who tried it. The difference came down to a single quality: the willingness to listen when the data says stop. Salomon August Andrée was born in Gränna, Sweden in 1854, a small town on the eastern shore of Lake Vättern. He was the son of a pharmacist, trained as a mechanical engineer, and by his early 40s had risen to chief engineer at the Swedish Royal Patent Office, a respectable post, a serious title, a man of systems and standards. He was methodical, analytical, precise. He believed in measurement, in calculation, and in the supremacy of rational planning over physical endurance. Where other men saw the Arctic as a test of the body, Andrée saw it as an engineering problem awaiting a technological solution. Between 1893 and 1895, he made 9 balloon ascents, including a remarkable solo flight across the Baltic Sea, studying wind currents and the principles of aerial navigation. He catalogued wind speeds. He measured drift rates. He developed theories about how a balloon could be steered not by engine, but by drag. He had never spent a winter in the Arctic. He had never made a multi-day balloon flight. He had never tested his steering system under anything resembling real polar conditions. But he had a theory, and in Sweden in the 1890s, a theory from an engineer of Andrée's reputation, backed by the right names and the right money, was enough. On February 13, 1895, Andrée stood before the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and presented his plan. He would fly a hydrogen balloon from Svalbard to the North Pole. The balloon, 4,531 cubic meters of varnished silk, filled with hydrogen gas, would carry 3 men, a full suite of scientific instruments, and enough supplies for months. 3 drag ropes, each approximately 1,000 meters long, would trail along the ground or ice surface below the balloon, creating friction that slowed the balloon relative to the wind. Sails mounted on the gondola would then allow limited directional control. Enough, Andrée argued, to steer the balloon at angles to the wind's natural path. 30 days of flight, over the pole, landing on the far side of the Arctic in Alaska or Russia or Canada. The Academy was electrified. Here was a Swedish solution to the world's last great geographic puzzle, not muscle and suffering, not years frozen in ice, engineering and elegance, a flight. If Sweden did not act now, the pole would be claimed by a Norwegian, or a Briton, or an American, and whoever planted their flag there first would own the story forever. Andrée understood immediately what this moment meant, and the moment understood him. The funding came fast. Alfred Nobel, inventor of dynamite, Sweden's richest and most famous citizen, contributed 65,000 krona. King Oscar II added 30,000 from the royal purse. Public subscriptions and institutional grants brought the total to approximately 130,000 krona, a fortune by the standards of the 1890s. But Andrée did not simply receive money. He received obligation. Nobel's name made the expedition a national project. The king's endorsement made it a matter of state prestige. The public's contributions, ordinary Swedes sending what they could afford, made it a promise, a contract between one man and an entire nation. This was no longer Andrée's idea. It belonged to Sweden, and Sweden does not accept the return of its faith. In the summer of 1896, the expedition traveled to Danes Island in Svalbard for its first attempt. A massive wooden balloon hangar was built at Virgohamna. The balloon was inflated. The world's press gathered on support vessels anchored offshore, pencils ready, pages blank. And then nothing. The winds blew from the north, day after day, week after week. A southerly wind was absolutely essential for launch, and it never came. The balloon sat in its hangar. Andrée paced. The journalists wrote about the weather. After weeks of waiting, Andrée called off the 1896 attempt and returned to Sweden. The public was patient. The press was understanding. But the clock was now ticking louder than before. The money had been spent on infrastructure. The hangar stood empty on a beach at the edge of the world. The credibility of the plan and of the man behind it depended entirely on a second attempt. Andrée could not fail to launch again. Not after this. Not after Nobel. Not after the king. And it was during this failed first attempt that the one man who could have saved all 3 lives discovered the truth about the balloon and was punished for telling it. The third member of the original expedition team was a meteorologist named Nils Gustaf Ekholm. Ekholm was rigorous, meticulous, unafraid of uncomfortable conclusions. And during the long weeks of waiting at Virgohamna in 1896, while the wind refused to cooperate, he did something that Andrée apparently never wanted done. He measured the balloon's actual hydrogen leakage rate. Not the theoretical rate from the manufacturer's specifications, not the optimistic rate from Andrée's calculations. The real rate, measured on site under field conditions with instruments. The results were devastating. The varnished silk envelope was losing hydrogen far faster than Andrée's numbers claimed. The seams leaked. The fabric breathed gas. Day by day, the balloon was slowly deflating, and no amount of varnish or patching could stop it. Ekholm did the math. At its actual leakage rate, the balloon could remain aloft for approximately 17 days, not 30, 17. And 17 days was not enough to reach the pole, let alone cross it and drift to landfall on the other side. The mission, as designed, was mathematically impossible. Ekholm reported his findings directly to Andrée. He recommended either commissioning an entirely new balloon, one built with better materials and tighter seams, or making fundamental structural modifications to the existing envelope. Andrée refused. He did not argue with Ekholm's numbers. He did not commission independent measurements. He did not seek a second opinion or present counterdata. He simply declined the recommendation and moved on. Ekholm withdrew from the expedition. And right here in this quiet exchange between 2 scientists in 1896 is where 3 men died, not on the ice, not in the October cold of Kvitøya. In a conversation, one man had data, the other had a dream. The dream won. Andrée found his replacement within months. His name was Knut Frenkel. He was 27 years old, a civil engineer, a mountaineer, physically strong, eager, willing, uncritical. And he knew nothing about meteorology, nothing about balloon engineering, nothing about the hydrogen leakage rate that made the entire mission impossible before it ever left the ground. The one voice saying, "This will not work," had been replaced by a voice that would never think to ask. On December 10th, 1896, Alfred Nobel died. His 65,000 krona was no longer an investment from a living patron who could shrug off a loss, who could say, "Well, we tried," over dinner and move on to the next venture. It was a legacy, a dead man's money spent in his name, carrying the full weight of his reputation. You can return a living man's money. You cannot return a dead man's faith. The trap was now complete. The expedition was ready. The balloon leaked. The man who proved it had been replaced. The man who paid for it was dead. The king was watching. The nation was watching. The press was watching. In less than 7 months, 3 men would climb into a wicker gondola and rise into the Arctic sky. What happens next is the part most accounts rush through, the moment where small decisions, each one reasonable, each one quiet, each one made with the best of intentions, locked the door behind them, one by one, until there was no door left. In late May 1897, the expedition departed Sweden for the second time. By June, they were back at Virgohamna. The balloon hangar from 1896 was refurbished. The silk envelope was reinflated with hydrogen, the same envelope, with the same seams, leaking at the same rate Ekholm had measured a year before. And then the waiting began again. Days of inactivity, Arctic fog rolling across the harbor in slow, heavy sheets, journalists on the support vessels running out of ways to describe the weather, Andrée moving through the hangar, checking ropes, adjusting equipment, performing the rituals of preparation that keep a man from thinking too carefully about what he's preparing for. The balloon's varnished silk continued to leak. The drag rope steering system, the entire theoretical basis for the expedition, had never been tested under real Arctic conditions. Not once. There had never been a single test flight of this balloon with all 3 men and full equipment aboard. None of this was discussed publicly. The narrative remained simple and clean. They were waiting for the right wind. The plan was sound. The technology was ready. Only the weather stood between Sweden and the pole. But inside that hangar, if you knew what to look for, the evidence was everywhere. The slow, invisible exhalation of hydrogen through silk, the untested connectors on the drag ropes, the weight calculations that assumed conditions no one had ever verified. You just had to be willing to see it. On the morning of July 11th, 1897, the wind shifted. After weeks of persistent northerlies, a southerly breeze began to blow across Virgohamna. Steady, consistent, pointed due north, pointed toward the pole. Andrée gave the order. The north wall of the balloon hangar was torn down, pulled apart by the ground crew to free the envelope. Support ropes were cut. Hydrogen strained against silk, lifting the gondola from the earth. At approximately 1:43 in the afternoon, Örnen, the Eagle, rose from the ground with 3 men aboard. Salomon August Andrée, age 42, the engineer who believed he could fly to the top of the world. Nils Strindberg, age 25, the physicist and photographer who carried his fiancée's picture in a locket around his neck. Knut Frenkel, age 27, the replacement, the man who didn't know what he didn't know. Below them, the men on the ground cheered. On the support vessels, journalists scribbled in notebooks. Cameras captured the moment, the balloon rising, the gondola swinging gently, 3 small figures silhouetted against the Arctic sky. No one on the ground noticed what happened next, not at first. It took a moment before someone looked down at the beach and saw what was lying there. Within minutes of launch, the entire technological premise of the expedition, the one thing that made a hydrogen balloon different from a death sentence, was gone. And Andrée, rising above the clouds, knew it before anyone on the ground did. By the time Örnen cleared the harbor and drifted north over the open water of the fjord, Andrée, Strindberg, and Frenkel were already alone. No radio, it hadn't been invented yet for practical use. No rescue protocol, no support vessel following below. No way to communicate with the world except 2 methods so primitive they border on absurd. Dropping cork-sealed buoy messages into the Arctic Ocean and hoping they washed up somewhere, or releasing carrier pigeons into winds that no pigeon had ever navigated. 3 men in a wicker basket, suspended beneath a silk bag filled with hydrogen, drifting over a frozen ocean at the top of the world. Everything still seemed possible. The wind was southerly. The sky was clear above the clouds. The pole lay ahead, somewhere beyond the white horizon. That illusion lasted less than 5 minutes. As the balloon rose from Vergohamna and drifted north over the fjord, the 3 drag ropes, each approximately 1,000 meters long, weighing hundreds of kilograms, coiled beneath the gondola like the tails of some enormous creature, began to unwind below. These ropes were not accessories. They were not safety features. They were not optional equipment. These ropes were the expedition. Without them, the balloon was not a steerable vehicle. It was a passenger of the wind, a silk bag drifting wherever atmospheric currents chose to push it, with no more directional control than a dandelion seed. The entire engineering argument that Andrée had made before the Academy, the entire theoretical framework that had persuaded Nobel and the King and the Swedish public to pour 130,000 krona into this venture, rested on a single mechanical principle. Those ropes, dragging along the surface below, would create friction that slowed the balloon relative to the wind. And that differential speed, balloon moving slower than air, would allow the sails mounted on the gondola to bite, to catch the wind at an angle, to steer. Without friction, no steering. Without steering, no expedition. Without the ropes, there was nothing separating this flight from throwing 3 men into the sky and hopping for the best. Within minutes of launch, the ropes twisted. The upper sections, attached to the gondola, began to rotate as the balloon turned slowly in the air. And at the connectors where the upper sections joined the lower sections, the threaded couplings unscrewed, silently, mechanically, with the quiet inevitability of physics doing what physics does. approximately 530 kilograms of rope separated from the balloon and fell. The lower sections landed on the beach at Vergohamna. The men on the ground saw them lying there, thick, heavy coils of rope, sprawled across the rocks like something dead. They understood immediately. Some of them must have felt their stomachs drop. Others may have simply stared, unable to process what they were seeing. The balloon, suddenly 530 kilograms lighter, surged upward, unburdened, uncontrollable, free in the worst possible sense of the word. There was no steering mechanism. There was no way to direct the flight. There was no way to descend safely and return. Örnen would go wherever the wind took it, north, east, west, in circles, and the three men inside the gondola had no say in the matter. And they knew it. Andrée knew it. He could feel the difference. The balloon was lighter. The ropes were gone. The sails were useless. He said nothing about aborting. There may have been nothing to say. The balloon was already above the fjord, already drifting, already committed. There was no mechanism for a controlled descent, no way to return to Vergohamna. The launch was a one-way door and they had walked through it. The engineering had failed. The theoretical framework was gone. The entire premise of the expedition had been reduced to a memory of rope lying on a beach. But this wasn't the moment that killed them. What killed them was slower, quieter, and still weeks away. For the next 65 hours, Örnen drifted. Not north toward the pole, as planned. Northeast first, then gradually east, pushed by winds that had no interest in Swedish ambitions or academy presentations or the dreams of engineers. The balloon moved where the atmosphere told it to move, and the atmosphere was not reading Andrée's flight plan. Inside the gondola, a cramped, circular basket roughly 4.5 meters in diameter, cluttered with instruments, supplies, sleeping equipment, and the personal effects of 3 men who expected to be aloft for a month, Andrée began to write. His diary entries from those first airborne hours are remarkable, not for what they say about the flight, for what they say about the man. He knew the ropes were gone. He knew the balloon couldn't be steered. He knew the wind was carrying them in the wrong direction. He knew, with the part of his mind that remained an engineer even when the rest had surrendered to something else, that the mission was already over. And he wrote this: "It is not a little strange to be floating here above the polar sea, to be the first that have floated here in a balloon. How soon, I wonder, shall we have successors? Shall we be thought mad, or will our example be followed?" Read that again, slowly. A man in an uncontrollable balloon, drifting over an ocean of ice, with no way to steer, no way to communicate, and no realistic chance of reaching his goal, and he's writing about wonder, about legacy, about whether history will call him mad or visionary. Whether that was courage, denial, or something darker, the eerie calm of a man who has already accepted the consequences of his own choices and is now simply observing them unfold, is a question that has never been fully answered. Perhaps all 3 existed simultaneously. Perhaps that's what it feels like when the weight of expectation finally lifts, when there's nothing left to decide, when the only thing remaining is to watch and record. He watched, he recorded. and the balloon continued to fail. As the hours passed, the Arctic began to claim Örnen inch by inch. Ice formed on the silk envelope, not thick, dramatic ice, but a thin, persistent glaze that accumulated gram by gram, hour by hour. Fog condensed on every surface. Moisture collected in the netting, in the rigging, on the ropes that still dangled uselessly from the gondola. Each gram of ice was nothing. Together, they were everything. The added weight dragged the balloon lower. Örnen sank toward the pack ice below, and the gondola began to bounce. Not gently. The bottom of the basket struck the ice surface, jolted upward, drifted, struck again. The men inside were thrown against equipment, against each other. Instruments rattled. Supplies shifted. Andrée responded the only way he could. He vented hydrogen. Opening the valve released gas, which temporarily made the balloon lighter relative to its internal volume, allowing it to rise. It was the only altitude control he had, and it worked briefly. The balloon would climb, drift above the fog, find clearer air. But every release of hydrogen shortened the flight. Every valve opening was a withdrawal from a bank account that was already overdrawn. He was spending the balloon's remaining life to solve problems that lasted minutes, buying hours of altitude with days of endurance. He was burning the future to survive the present. At 10 o'clock in the evening on July 11th, the day of launch, they dropped a buoy message. A small, sealed cylinder tossed over the side of the gondola into the void below. Our journey has gone well so far. We are still at a height of 250 meters. Direction initially N10 degrees E, but later N45 degrees E above the clouds since 7:45. It would wash ashore near Kolgev Island in the Barents Sea. In May of 1899, nearly 2 years later. It was the last message the outside world would receive for 33 years. On July 13th, 2 days into the flight, a carrier pigeon was released from the gondola. Strapped to its leg was a small aluminum capsule containing a slip of paper. Position: 82 degrees 2 minutes north, 15 degrees 5 minutes east. Good speed to east 10 degrees south, all well on board. This is the third pigeon post. The pigeon was found by Norwegian seal hunters 2 days later, on July 15th. They read the message. All well on board. In a balloon that couldn't steer, that was losing gas, that was accumulating ice, that was drifting east instead of north, carried by winds that would never deliver it to the pole. All well on board. By July 14th, 65 hours after launch, Örnen could no longer rise. The ice on the envelope was too heavy. The hydrogen was too depleted. The laws of physics, temporarily suspended by ambition, had reasserted themselves with quiet finality. The balloon was coming down. At approximately 7:22 in the morning on July 14th, 1897, the balloon made final contact with the Arctic pack ice. It did not crash in the dramatic sense. There was no explosion, no tearing, no fire. The gondola simply settled onto the frozen surface and stayed there, the deflating envelope sagging around it like a collapsed lung. Position: 82 degrees 56 minutes north, 29 degrees 52 minutes east. They had flown for 65 hours. They had covered approximately 475 kilometers, but not toward the pole. The wind had carried them northeast and then east. They were roughly 780 kilometers from their goal. They had crossed barely a third of the distance, and they had drifted in the wrong direction. The balloon lay on the ice like a dead animal. Thousands of square meters of varnished silk and cotton netting spread across the white surface, fluttering weakly in the wind. The gondola sat among the wreckage, tilted, surrounded by rope and rigging. The silence must have been immense. 3 men stood beside the wreckage with sledges, a small boat, and supplies they had packed for exactly this moment. And here is the detail that makes this story something more than a tragedy of bad luck, something more than a cautionary tale about the limits of technology. Andrée had packed emergency sledging supplies. Before he left Sweden, he had arranged for 3 sledges, a boat sledge, food rations, a Primus stove, fuel, ammunition, and survival equipment to be stowed in the gondola. Everything 3 men would need to walk out of the Arctic if the balloon failed. He had prepared for the balloon's failure. He had planned for this, which means he knew. On some level, in some compartment of his engineer's mind that he refused to open in public, that he sealed shut during academy presentations and press interviews and conversations with his king, he knew the balloon might not make it. He knew Ekholm might have been right. He knew the leakage might be fatal. He knew the ropes might fail, the winds might refuse, the ice might claim the silk. He packed for failure. He planned for the worst case. He built a contingency for a mission he publicly insisted was certain to succeed. And then he launched anyway. The contradiction sits at the center of this story like a stone in the throat. You cannot resolve it. You can only stare at it. Nils Strindberg, standing on the ice beside the deflated balloon, did what he had been trained to do. He unpacked his camera. He set up his tripod on the frozen surface, and he began to photograph. The deflated balloon, the scattered equipment, the gondola still connected by ropes to the collapsed envelope. 3 men standing in a white void that extended to the horizon in every direction. No landmarks, no features, just ice and sky and the wreckage of a dream. Those photographs, careful, composed, unflinching, would not be seen by another human being for 33 years. For 8 days, they camped at the crash site. There was no urgency yet, not the kind that kills. They had supplies. They had shelter in the gondola. They had time to sort equipment, repair sledges, calculate distances, and plan their route south. On July 22, 1897, 8 days after the balloon came down, the ice march began. 3 men, 3 sledges, a boat sledge, a small wooden boat mounted on runners that could be dragged over ice or launched into open water. Approximately 400 kilograms of supplies, food, fuel, ammunition, scientific instruments, the camera, the diaries, the letters Strindberg was writing to Anna that he could never send. 400 kilograms. Divided among 3 men, over terrain that no one in the history of human civilization had ever tried to cross on foot. And between them and safety, an ocean of frozen, moving, chaotic pack ice. Their initial target was Cape Flora on the southern coast of Franz Josef Land, roughly 300 kilometers to the southeast. Supply depots had been left there by the British Jackson Harmsworth expedition years earlier. Cached food, fuel, building materials. If they could reach Cape Flora, they would find shelter. They would find sustenance. They would survive. 300 kilometers across the ice with sledges. It sounded possible. It sounded like a plan an engineer could calculate: distance divided by daily progress, calories consumed versus calories burned, fuel reserves versus cooking needs. They began walking south, and the ice began drifting north. This is the cruelty of the Arctic pack ice, the thing that no amount of engineering can overcome, the thing that makes it different from every other terrain on Earth. It is not solid ground. It is not a landscape. It is a frozen ocean, and like all oceans, it moves. Currents beneath the surface, deep, powerful, indifferent, push the ice in directions that have nothing to do with where you want to go. The ice doesn't care about your compass bearing. It doesn't care about your cached supplies at Cape Flora. It moves where the water takes it. You can march south for 8 hours. You can haul 400 kilograms of supplies over pressure ridges that stand 3 meters high, ridges made of broken ice plates forced upward by the collision of flows, ridges that require unloading every sledge, carrying every piece of equipment over by hand, reloading on the other side, and continuing. You can do this for 12 hours straight, until your shoulders burn and your hands are raw inside your gloves, and your legs have stopped sending coherent messages to your brain. And then you can collapse into your sleeping bag, take a position reading, and discover that the ice has carried you 5 kilometers back the way you came. You have spent 12 hours gaining nothing. They were walking on a treadmill, and they didn't have the strength to outpace it. By late August, a full month into the march, it was clear they would never reach Franz Josef Land. The ice drift was carrying them west, relentlessly, refusing to let them go east. Cape Flora might as well have been on the moon. Andrée changed course. Now they would aim for the 7 Islands Esjärjen, a small archipelago north of the main island of Spitsbergen. Closer, more directly south, perhaps reachable if the ice cooperated. The ice did not cooperate. Days blurred into weeks. The sameness was crushing. Ice, fog, pressure ridges, open leads of black water cutting across their path without warning, forcing them to detour for hours or launch the boat sledge, row across, haul it out on the other side, and reload. Progress was sometimes less than 2 kilometers per day of effective southward distance. 2 kilometers. After 12 hours of the most physically demanding work any of them had ever experienced. They shot polar bears, they shot seals, the crack of the rifle breaking the Arctic silence, the butchering of carcasses on the ice, blood steaming in the cold air. The meat sustained them, protein, fat, calories, life. But the meat was also killing them, and they had no way of knowing. The food that sustained their bodies was filling them with something that would destroy them from the inside. The answer to what actually killed Andrée, Strindberg, and Frenkel wouldn't be understood for another 55 years. Through August and September of 1897, the three men ground their way south across the pack ice. Andrée's diary entries from this period are methodical, almost mechanical. Distances walked, distances drifted, animals killed, weather conditions, temperature, wind direction, cloud cover. He recorded everything with the precision of an engineer filing a daily report, as if the act of measuring could impose order on a situation that had no order, as if numbers arranged in neat columns could hold back the chaos. But between the numbers, in the spaces between entries, in the occasional sentence that breaks from the pattern, the human cost leaks through. Their clothing was perpetually wet, not damp, wet. Arctic moisture has no respect for wool or leather or canvas. It seeps into everything, driven by fog and sweat and the condensation of breath, and it never fully dries because the air itself is saturated and the sun, when it appears at all, carries no warmth. They walked in wet clothing. They slept in wet sleeping bags. The cold wasn't just a temperature. It was a presence, something that lived in the fabric against their skin, that pressed against their bodies every minute of every hour. Temperatures hovered around -10 to -15 degrees Celsius. Not the killing cold of deep winter that would come later, but a steady, grinding cold that sapped energy without delivering the mercy of numbness. Fog erased the horizon for days at a time, reducing the world to a circle of gray-white nothing, 20 meters in diameter, moving with them wherever they went. And beneath it all, constant as a heartbeat, the sound of ice plates grinding against each other, a low, deep moan, punctuated by cracks and groans, as if the ocean itself were in pain. And their bodies were changing. It started gradually, so gradually they could explain it away. Muscle pain, not the ordinary soreness of exertion. Every Arctic traveler expects that, but something deeper, something that settled into the fibers of their muscles and stayed, an ache that rest did not relieve, that sleep did not repair, that seemed to grow worse even as their bodies should have been adapting to the work. Fatigue beyond what exertion alone could explain, a heaviness in the limbs that went beyond tiredness, a weakness that felt wrong, out of proportion to the effort. Digestive distress, fevers that came and went without pattern, swelling in the face and extremities. They attributed it to exhaustion, to the cold, to the relentless physical punishment of hauling 400 kilograms of supplies over broken ice for 12 hours a day, day after day, week after week. They were pushing their bodies to the limit. Of course they felt terrible. Any man would. They were wrong. The polar bear meat they were eating, often undercooked, because fuel for the Primus stove was precious, and every gram of kerosene spent on cooking was a gram not available for melting drinking water, and fully cooking large quantities of bear meat consumed time they didn't have, was infected with Trichinella spiralis. Parasitic roundworms, microscopic, invisible in the meat, present in virtually every polar bear in the Arctic. When ingested in undercooked meat, Trichinella larvae survive the human stomach. They enter the intestinal wall, they reproduce, and then the larvae migrate through the bloodstream into the muscles. They burrow into muscle tissue and encyst there, forming tiny capsules. Each capsule triggers inflammation. The immune system responds: fever, swelling, agonizing muscle pain, progressive fatigue, diarrhea. In severe cases, damage to the heart muscle, respiratory failure. The symptoms mimic and amplify the effects of exhaustion and cold exposure. You cannot distinguish trichinosis from the natural consequences of Arctic travel unless you know what you're looking for. And in 1897, almost no one knew what to look for. Andrée, Strindberg, and Frenkel had no way of knowing that every meal was making them weaker, that the calories keeping their hearts beating were carrying passengers, that the one thing sustaining them, the warm, fatty, protein-rich bear meat cooked over a Primus stove in the shelter of a canvas tent, was systematically destroying their ability to survive. The food was a trap, and it had been sprung weeks ago. If you've stayed this far, you understand something that most accounts of this expedition miss entirely. These men were not killed by bad luck. They were not killed by the weather. They were not even killed by the balloon's failure, though that failure was dramatic and complete. They were killed by a chain of decisions, each one reasonable, each one quiet, each one irreversible. A chain that began in a Stockholm lecture hall 2 years before and ended on an ice floe in the Arctic Ocean, with 3 men eating meat that was destroying them from the inside and writing diary entries that no one would read for 3 decades. What happens next is the part of this story that stays with people. By late September, the 3 men stopped trying to walk. It wasn't surrender, not exactly. It was the kind of decision that looks like strategy but feels like exhaustion, the point where the mind, searching for any option that doesn't require standing up, finds one and calls it a plan. Ice conditions had deteriorated. The pack ice, which in summer can be traversed brutally, slowly, painfully, but traversed, was breaking apart beneath them. Open leads of black water sliced across their path like wounds in the surface. Pressure ridges, which had been obstacles before, now became impassable walls. Not because the men lacked the strength to climb them, though they were weakening daily, but because the ice around the ridges was unstable, liable to fracture underfoot, to dump a man and his sledge into water that would kill him in minutes. Their bodies were failing in ways they couldn't explain and couldn't stop. The muscle pain was constant now. The fatigue was bottomless. Each morning, the act of standing up, of lifting equipment, of placing one foot in front of the other, required a conscious decision that felt less like determination and more like defiance of gravity. Andrée made a decision. They would build a shelter, a makeshift hut constructed from ice blocks and whatever materials they could spare on a large, stable ice floe. They would stop fighting the ice. They would let the natural drift carry them south toward Svalbard. They would rest, they would eat, they would wait. It was, ironically, the closest Andrée ever came to Nansen's philosophy. Let the ice do the work, trust the drift, stop fighting nature and start cooperating with it. If he appreciated the irony, he didn't write it down. For a few days it seemed to work. The floe drifted south. The men rested as much as men riddled with parasites and sleeping on ice could rest. They ate polar bear meat. They cooked over the Primus stove. They wrote in their diaries. Then the floe broke apart. In early October, their ice floe fractured beneath them. It didn't happen all at once. It began with a sound, a deep, resonant crack like a bone breaking inside a body. Then a line appeared in the ice, thin at first, then wider, then water, black and impossibly cold, welling up from below. They scrambled. There was no time for orderly evacuation. They threw equipment into the boat. They hauled supplies across ice that was splitting under their feet. They launched the boat sledge into the gap between the fragments of what had been their home for days and rode through a chaos of broken ice and freezing seawater, chunks of ice scraping against the hull, the world reduced to noise and cold and the desperate mechanics of survival. On October 5, 1897, they reached land. Kvitøya, White Island. A small, desolate slab of rock and glacier at 80 degrees, 40 minutes north, in the far eastern corner of the Svalbard archipelago. One of the most remote, most inhospitable, most thoroughly forgotten places on the surface of the earth. Almost the entire island is covered by a glacier, a permanent cap of ice that flows slowly toward the sea, calving icebergs from its edges. The exposed rock is minimal, a strip of gray-black shore, swept by wind and spray, littered with the bones of seabirds and the detritus of centuries, surrounded by heavy pack ice for most of the year, visited by humans so rarely that it might as well not exist. There were no supply depots, no shelter, no cached food, no other human beings within 150 kilometers, and those 150 kilometers were open sea, choked with ice, impossible to cross in a small boat crewed by men whose muscles were being eaten from the inside. But it was land. Solid ground, rock beneath their feet instead of ice that drifted and cracked and betrayed. After 3 months on the moving pack ice, 3 months of walking on a surface that shifted beneath them, that carried them backward, that split without warning, they could stand on something that would not move. They set up camp on the rocky shore. A tent, the Primus stove, what remained of their supplies, ammunition, the camera, the diaries, and the polar bear meat that was slowly, methodically, invisibly killing them. They had survived the balloon crash. They had survived 3 months on the pack ice. They had walked, hauled, rode, and fought their way across 300 kilometers of the most hostile terrain on the planet. They had reached land. And now, on solid ground, within 150 kilometers of settlements where people lived and breathed and could have helped them, they began to die. Nils Strindberg was likely the first. He was 25 years old, a physicist, a photographer, a man whose quiet brilliance had been spent over the previous 3 months documenting the slow unraveling of an expedition he had trusted with his life. He had photographed the balloon on the ice, 3 men hauling sledges through fog, polar bears shot and butchered, the vast, featureless white, camp scenes, the tent, the stove, equipment laid out with the care of men who had nothing left but routine. 93 images in total, captured on glass photographic plates that he carried in his pack across every pressure ridge, through every open lead, over every mile of drifting ice. He carried something else, too. Before leaving Sweden, Nils Strindberg had become engaged to Anna Charlier, She was young. He was young. They had the kind of love that exists before life has had a chance to complicate it, uncomplicated, absolute, built on the assumption that the future would be long enough to contain everything they planned. He carried her photograph in a locket around his neck. He wrote her letters during the expedition, pages of longing and love, and the ordinary intimacies of a man talking to the woman he expected to marry. Letters he folded and kept in his clothing, knowing he could never send them, writing them anyway, because the act of writing to Anna was the act of remaining Nils, of remaining human, of remaining someone who existed outside this white void. Sometime in early to mid-October 1897, Strindberg died. The exact date is unknown. The diaries by this point are fragmentary and deteriorating. The cause was almost certainly the same combination that would kill all three of them. Trichinosis destroying his muscles and organs from the inside, the larvae encysted in his heart, his diaphragm, the muscles of his throat, compounded by 3 months of exhaustion, chronic malnutrition despite the abundance of meat, and the relentless, patient cold of an Arctic October. Andrée and Frenkel buried him. They carried his body or dragged it, because by this point neither man had the strength for carrying to a crevice in the rocks along the shore. They covered it with stones, one by one, heavy stones lifted with hands that shook, placed by men who knew they were building not just a grave but a precedent. A cairn on a glacier island, at the edge of the world, marking the resting place of a 25-year-old physicist who had trusted the wrong man's engineering. The locket with Anna's photograph was still around his neck. They did not remove it. Then they continued, Andrée and Frenkel, 2 men now instead of 3. Because there was nothing else to do. Andrée's diary entries from Kvitøya are fragmentary. The handwriting, once precise, once the product of an engineer's trained hand, deteriorates entry by entry. The letters grow larger, less controlled. The lines wander across the page. Sentences that once ran in straight, measured rows now bend and stagger like the steps of a man losing his balance. He recorded weather, the state of their camp, wind direction, temperature, the movements of bears in the vicinity, practical matters, noted with the stubborn persistence of a man whose mind still insisted on taking observations even as his body forgot how to hold a pencil steady. There is no despair in the final pages. That is perhaps the most unsettling thing about Andrée's diary, the thing that separates it from other final testaments, from other last words written by dying men in desperate places. There is no raging, no bargaining, no plea to God or king or country, no apology, no final letter to a loved one. Andrée, unlike Strindberg, had no fiancée, no wife, no one waiting for him in the specific, personal way that Anna waited for Nils. Just observations, data, the weather, the camp notes. As if he were still filing a report, as if the academy were still waiting for his findings, as if the act of recording could, by itself, impose meaning on what had become meaningless. His last clearly readable entry is dated approximately October 17, 1897. After that, the writing stops. Not with a period, not with a concluding sentence, not with a farewell. Mid-thought, mid-sentence, the pencil lifted from the page and not returned, as if the hand holding it simply decided without drama, without announcement, that it was finished, that there was nothing left to measure. Nut Frinkle died around the same time. His body was found near the camp, partially covered by snow, by canvas, by the efforts of whoever was still alive to provide some small dignity. His own diary, a terse meteorological almanac, ended even more abruptly. No final reflection, no personal words, just data and then nothing. Andrée's body was found leaning against a rock, not lying down, sitting, as if he had simply stopped. His diary was beside him, the notebook containing 3 months of observations, reflections, data, and the slow deterioration of a man's handwriting and a man's world. They had survived the balloon, they had survived the crash, they had survived 3 months on the ice, they had reached land, solid, stable, unmoving land. And then they died. Killed not by the cold, not by starvation, they had food, not by the Arctic in any way they could have anticipated or planned for or engineered their way around. Killed almost certainly by the food they were eating, the polar bear meat that had kept their hearts beating, that had provided the calories and protein and fat that fueled their march across the ice, had been filling their muscles with parasitic larvae. The thing that looked like salvation, warm meat, cooked over a stove, eaten in a tent, was the thing that ended them. The Arctic did not even need to hurry. It only needed patience. 3 men, a hydrogen balloon, 65 hours of flight, 90 days on the ice, a cairn of stones on a glacier island. And then silence. For 33 years, the world heard nothing. The Arctic kept its secret with the indifference of something that has never been asked and will never answer. What comes next is the part of this story that makes it impossible to forget. Back in Sweden, the silence was at first hopeful. Andrée had told them the flight could take 30 days, possibly longer. The balloon might drift beyond the pole and continue over Russia, over Siberia, over Alaska. Communication would be impossible during the flight. Silence was expected. Silence was part of the plan. A few weeks without word meant nothing. He was simply still aloft, drifting above the clouds, making his scientific observations, recording wind speeds and temperatures and the view from above the Arctic, the view that no human eyes had ever seen. Weeks became months. The optimism thinned but did not break. Perhaps the balloon had landed in some remote corner of Siberia. Perhaps Andrée and his men were trekking overland toward a telegraph station. The Arctic is vast. Communication is slow. Patience was required. Months became a year. In May of 1899, nearly 2 years after the launch, buoy message number 4 washed ashore near Kvalgøv Island in the Barents Sea. Dated July 11th, 1897, the day of launch. Our journey has gone well so far. We are still at a height of 250 meters. 4 months later, in September 1899, a second buoy message was found in Iceland, also dated July 11th, also cheerful, also from a world that no longer existed. The messages were from the first hours of the flight. They said nothing about what happened after. They were postcards from the beginning of a story whose ending remained unknown. After that, nothing. Search parties were organized. Ships sailed north. Men scanned the ice with telescopes looking for wreckage, a signal, a flag, a body. They found nothing. The Arctic is not a place that returns what it takes. It absorbs, it buries, it waits. Theories multiplied in the absence of facts. Perhaps they had reached the pole and drifted onward to some uncharted coast. Perhaps they had been rescued by indigenous peoples in Siberia or northern Canada and were living among them, unable to communicate with the outside world. Perhaps the balloon had carried them so far beyond the known map that they had simply fallen off the edge of what civilization could track. Year by year, the theories grew less hopeful. The silence grew heavier. The Andrée expedition became a ghost story. 3 men who rose into the sky on a summer afternoon and simply ceased to exist. No wreckage, no graves, no final message, just the memory of a balloon ascending, of cheering on a beach, and then nothing. A gap in the record. A blank space on the map of history that mirrored the blank space on the map of the Arctic that had started the whole thing. Anna Charlier waited. She waited the way people wait when they have no information, without a timeline, without a framework, without even the terrible certainty of grief. She existed in the space between hope and mourning. A space that has no name and no end, where every knock on the door might be news and every day without a knock is another day of not knowing. In 1910, 13 years after Nils Strindberg climbed into a balloon gondola and drifted north into the sky, Anna married an Englishman named Gilbert Hawtrey. She did not wait because she had given up. She waited 13 years. 13 years is not giving up. 13 years is the outer boundary of what the human heart can sustain without an answer. She married, she continued, she lived. The world moved on around the silence. The pole was claimed by Robert Peary in 1909, or at least Peary said it was, and enough people believed him. The achievement that Andrée had died for was accomplished by a man using dog sledges and indigenous Arctic techniques. Not a balloon, not Swedish engineering, dogs and skis and Inuit knowledge. Nansen's philosophy, not Andrée's. Powered flight arrived. The Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk in 1903. Within 2 decades, airplanes were crossing oceans. The balloon, the cutting-edge technology that Andrée had staked his life on, became a relic, a curiosity, a thing from a previous century's imagination. The First World War came and went. 10 million dead. The old certainties of European civilization, the belief in progress, in technology, in the inevitable triumph of rational planning, were buried in the mud of Flanders alongside the men who had believed in them. The 1920s roared and then collapsed. And on a tiny, icebound island at the far eastern edge of the Svalbard archipelago, an island so remote that it had been visited by humans perhaps a handful of times in all of recorded history, 3 men lay exactly where they had fallen, undisturbed, unvisited, unknown. The ice covered them, the snow buried them, the seasons turned light to dark 33 times. And then someone came. On August 5, 1930, 33 years, 3 weeks and 4 days after the launch. The Norwegian sealing and scientific vessel Brattvåg made an unscheduled stop at Kvitøya. The Brattvåg was not looking for Andrée. No one was looking for Andrée anymore. The expedition had passed from mystery into legend, from legend into footnote. The Brattvåg was conducting a routine scientific survey of the Svalbard archipelago, collecting geological and biological samples. Kvitøya was on the itinerary only because unusual ice conditions that summer had opened a passage to the island's shore, a passage that was normally choked with pack ice year-round. Most years you could not reach Kvitøya if you wanted to. In the summer of 1930, the ice pulled back just far enough to let a ship through, a gap in the armor, a window that might not open again for years. Crew members went ashore, not all of them. A small party, sealers and scientists, picking their way across the rocky beach, looking for whatever the island had to offer. Geological samples, bird colonies, the ordinary business of a survey expedition. They found a boat. It was sitting on the rocks above the waterline, half buried in snow and debris. Old, weathered, but recognizably a boat, a small, clinker-built vessel of the type used by Arctic expeditions decades earlier. They found scattered equipment, a Primus stove, cooking implements, ammunition boxes, clothing stiff and frozen, bleached by decades of sun and ice. They found a metal hook protruding from the snow. They pulled at it. More equipment emerged. A canvas bag, navigation instruments, personal effects. And then they found human remains. A body, sitting upright, leaning against a rock, not lying down, not curled up, sitting, as if the man had simply stopped moving and the cold had preserved him in the posture of his last moment. Beside the body, a notebook, a diary. On the clothing, still legible after 33 years in the Arctic, a monogram. Essay. Salomon August Andrée. 33 years dead, still sitting where he had died, still leaning against the rock he had chosen or collapsed against in October of 1897. The crew of the Brattvåg stood on that beach and looked at what they had found. They were sealers and scientists, practical men, men accustomed to the brutalities of the Arctic. But this was different. This was not a dead seal or a geological formation. This was a man who had been famous, who had been mourned, whose disappearance had been one of the great mysteries of the age. And he had been here the entire time, 150 kilometers from settlements, on an island no one visited, preserved by the cold, hidden by the ice, waiting for someone to come. They contacted Norway by ship's radio. The news traveled south. Within hours, the world knew. Within weeks, a second expedition, aboard the vessel Isbjørn, returned to Kvitøya to conduct a full recovery. They found Strindberg's body under its cairn of stones. The cairn was intact. The stones had not shifted. 33 years, and the grave Andrée and Frinkel had built with shaking hands still held its shape. They found Frinkel nearby, partially covered, less protected but present, accounted for. They recovered journals, almanacs, scientific instruments, clothing, ammunition, cooking equipment, navigation tools, the Primus stove, personal effects bearing the names and monograms of men who had been dead longer than some of the recovery crew had been alive. They found Strindberg's locket around his neck. The chain had not broken. The clasp had not failed. Inside, behind a small glass cover, a photograph of Anna Charlier, faded but recognizable. The face of a woman who, at that moment, was 59 years old and living in England under a different name. 33 years in the ice. The locket was still there. And they found Strindberg's photographic plates, 93 exposed glass negatives, carefully packed, carried across the ice for 3 months in a wooden case that had protected them through everything: the crash, the march, the boat crossing, the final camp on Kvitøya. 33 years old, sealed in the cold, preserved by the very environment that had killed the man who took them. In Stockholm, in darkrooms that smelled of chemicals and concentration, technicians began the work of developing Strindberg's photographs. The process was painstaking. The glass plates had been exposed to 33 years of freezing, thawing, and moisture. The emulsion, the light-sensitive coating that held the images, had degraded. In many cases, the damage was total. The image was gone, dissolved by time and chemistry into a uniform gray nothing. But others survived. Enough survived. And when the images emerged from the developing trays, slowly, like ghosts rising through water, the world saw something it had never seen before and would never see again. 3 men on the ice. The deflated balloon, lying in a heap of varnished silk and cotton netting, collapsed on the frozen surface like the shed skin of something enormous. The gondola tilted among the wreckage, ropes trailing across the ice. A polar bear shot and being butchered, dark blood on white ice. Men working with knives, their faces turned away from the camera, concentrating on the work of survival. Camp scenes, the tent, the stove, equipment laid out with the care of men who had nothing left but routine and order. 3 figures standing together, dwarfed by the ice, by the fog, by the immensity of nothing that surrounded them in every direction. Fog whiteness, horizon dissolving into sky, a world without edges. The photographs are ghostly. There is no other word for them. The exposure is uneven. The contrast is low. Edges dissolve into white as if the images are being slowly reclaimed by the blankness they depict. They look less like photographs and more like memories, the kind of images that appear in the mind when you're trying to remember something that happened a very long time ago. Partial, luminous, fading even as you look at them. These men had been dead for 33 years before anyone saw their photographs. Think about that. The pictures existed before their audience did. The images were captured, sealed, and preserved, waiting in the dark for 3 decades while the world that produced them changed beyond recognition. While empires fell, wars were fought, technologies were invented that made the balloon look like a toy. They are messages from men who were already ghosts when the shutter clicked. The photographs show living men, men who ate and walked and worried and hoped, but we cannot look at them without knowing, without seeing death in every frame, without understanding that the man adjusting the stove would be buried under stones within weeks, that the man writing in his notebook would be found leaning against a rock 33 years later by strangers who weren't looking for him. They didn't know they were ghosts yet. That's what makes the photographs unbearable. On October 5, 1930, exactly 33 years and 1 day after the 3 men stumbled ashore on Kvitøya, their remains were carried through the streets of Stockholm in a state funeral. The date was not chosen by accident. Someone in the planning committee had done the math. King Gustaf V attended. The entire Swedish government was present. Military honor guards lined the route. Thousands of citizens, tens of thousands by some accounts, stood along the streets in the October cold, watching the procession pass. 3 coffins, draped in the Swedish flag, carried on horse-drawn gun carriages through the city where Andrée had once presented his plan to the Academy, where Nobel's money had been counted, where Ekholm's warnings had been ignored. The nation that had sent them was receiving them back. And in the crowd, somewhere among the thousands, standing on a Stockholm street on an October morning, 33 years older than the last time she had seen the man she loved, a woman named Anna Hawtrey watched. Nay Charlier. She was 59 years old. She had been 26 when Nils Strindberg left. She had waited 13 years for news that never came. She had married another man. She had built a life, a full, complete, real life, in the space that Strindberg's absence had created. She had done what the living do. She had continued. And now she was standing in a crowd, watching his coffin pass. When they found his body on Kvitøya, the locket was still around his neck. Her photograph was still inside. The face she had worn at 26, young, hopeful, unaware of what was coming, preserved in miniature behind glass, pressed against the chest of a man who had been dead since she was 26 years old. 33 years in the ice. And it was still there. Some stories end with an explanation, a cause of death, a chain of decisions, a lesson about the dangers of ambition or the limits of technology or the indifference of nature. This story ends with a locket. For decades after the discovery, the cause of death was debated. The obvious answers, cold, starvation, exposure, were proposed first, because they were simple and because they fit the narrative that people wanted to believe. Brave men, overwhelmed by the Arctic, defeated by forces beyond their control. But the obvious answers didn't fully fit. The men had food. Polar bear meat was available on Kvitøya. They had shot bears during their march, and bears were present near the camp. They had a stove and fuel to cook with. They had shelter materials. They had reached land, solid, stable land, after 3 months on moving ice. Men with food, fuel, and shelter do not typically die within days of reaching safety. Something else was happening, something the diaries couldn't explain because the men themselves didn't understand it. In 1952, 22 years after the discovery, 55 years after the deaths, a Danish physician named Ernst Adam Tried proposed the answer that is now most widely accepted by the medical and historical communities. Trichinosis. The diaries documented extensive consumption of polar bear meat. Entry after entry described bears killed, butchered, and eaten. The meat was sometimes described as undercooked. Andrée noted on more than one occasion that they ate meat that was not fully prepared, because fuel was limited and time was short, and hunger does not wait for a properly cooked dinner. Polar bears in the Arctic carry Trichinella parasites at extraordinarily high rates. Studies conducted after 1930 showed infection rates in Arctic bears approaching 90% in some populations. The parasite is killed by thorough cooking, sustained temperatures above 70 degrees Celsius throughout the meat, but survives in meat that is rare, underdone, or hastily prepared over a camp stove by men who are exhausted and starving. Trichinella larvae ingested in undercooked meat penetrate the intestinal wall within days. They enter the bloodstream. They migrate to striated muscle tissue, the muscles of the arms, the legs, the chest, the diaphragm, the heart. They encyst, forming calcified capsules that trigger intense inflammatory responses. The immune system attacks. Fever climbs. Muscles swell and harden with pain. The simplest movements, walking, lifting, breathing, become agonizing. The heart, which is itself a muscle, can be compromised. In severe infections, the diaphragm, the muscle that drives respiration, can be so heavily parasitized that breathing becomes labored, then difficult, then impossible. The three men ate the food that kept them moving, and the food systematically destroyed their ability to move. Some researchers have also proposed carbon monoxide poisoning as a contributing factor, the result of burning kerosene in the Primus stove inside an enclosed tent or snow shelter, in conditions where ventilation was inadequate. Carbon monoxide is colorless, odorless, and lethal in enclosed spaces. The symptoms, headache, confusion, drowsiness, loss of consciousness, could easily be mistaken for exhaustion or the effects of cold. The two causes are not mutually exclusive. Both may have played a role. Trichinosis weakening their bodies over weeks. Carbon monoxide delivering the final blow on a night when the tent was sealed too tightly against the wind and the stove burned too long. But the central irony remains the same regardless of which specific mechanism struck last. They were not killed by the Arctic's hostility. They were killed by what the Arctic offered them. The thing that looked like salvation, warm meat, cooked over a stove, eaten in a shelter on dry land, was the thing that ended them. The warmth of the stove may have poisoned their air. The meat on their plates was poisoning their muscles. Everything that felt like survival was, in fact, the final stage of dying. The food was the answer, the polar bear meat. The thing keeping them alive was the thing destroying them. And in 1897, standing on a frozen beach at the edge of the world, eating what the Arctic provided and feeling grateful for it, they had no way to know. When news of the discovery reached the world in 1930, the story was told the way the world needed to hear it. Heroic failure. 3 brave Swedes who dared to challenge the Arctic and were defeated by its overwhelming power. Martyrs to science. Victims of nature's cruelty. Noble men brought down by forces no human could withstand. The state funeral reinforced this narrative. The king attended. The flags flew at half-mast. The coffins were draped in blue and gold. The nation mourned its sons as heroes. But that is not what happened. The Arctic did not surprise Andrée. Andrée surprised himself. Go back to the chain. Follow it link by link. not with the hindsight of judgment, but with the clear, cold eye of the engineering that Andrée himself claimed to worship. Link 1. He chose a hydrogen balloon as his vehicle, a machine that, by its fundamental nature, cannot be controlled. It goes where the wind goes. The drag rope steering system was untested theory, not proven engineering. No balloon in history had ever been steered across a polar ice cap. Andrée committed the lives of 3 men to a machine that offered speed but zero reliability. Link 2. His own meteorologist, a qualified, rigorous scientist, measured the balloon's hydrogen leakage rate and reported that the envelope could sustain approximately 17 days of flight, not 30. Andrée's entire plan required 30. The mission was mathematically impossible. Andrée did not dispute the numbers. He ignored them. Link 3. He replaced Ekholm, the man with the data, the man telling the truth, with Frinkel, a young engineer who had no meteorological expertise and no basis for questioning the balloon's capabilities. The one voice of dissent was not overruled. It was not debated. It was removed. And in its place, a voice was installed that would never think to ask. Link 4. Alfred Nobel died and the money became sacred. A living patron can absorb a loss. A dead patron's money carries the weight of legacy. Returning it would have felt like betrayal. Canceling would have felt like desecration. Link 5. The drag ropes failed within minutes of launch. 530 kilograms of steering mechanism left lying on a beach. The entire engineering premise, the only thing separating this flight from suicide, was gone before the balloon cleared the harbor. And still, they did not turn back. There was no mechanism for turning back. The launch was a one-way door, and they had designed it that way. Link 6. Andrée vented hydrogen during flight to manage altitude, spending the balloon's remaining endurance to solve problems that lasted minutes, trading tomorrow's survival for today's comfort, accelerating the very failure he was trying to prevent. The balloon crashed. They marched. They ate polar bear meat that was destroying them from the inside. They reached land and died. 6 decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, each one quiet, each one made by rational people, or at least by people who believed themselves to be rational for understandable reasons. No single moment of obvious recklessness, no dramatic failure, no clear point where a reasonable person would have said, "This is insane, stop everything." Just a steady, relentless narrowing of options, decision by decision, link by link, until the chain was too short to reach safety and too strong to break. That is how most disasters happen, not with a bang, not with a dramatic failure that announces itself, not with a single catastrophic mistake that everyone can point to afterward and say, "There, that's where it went wrong." With a series of nods, with a sequence of reasonable choices, each one building on the last, each one closing a door so quietly that no one hears it shut, with the slow, imperceptible accumulation of small compromises, small oversights, small acts of optimism disguised as confidence. Until one morning you're standing on the ice and the balloon is deflated, and the ropes are gone, and the food is poisoning you, and the closest settlement is 150 kilometers of open water away. And you look back along the chain, and realize that every single link was forged by your own hand. There was no single moment where this expedition crossed from possible to doomed. Only a chain of choices, each one made by people who believed they were being rational, each one closing a door that could never be reopened. Andrée was not a fool. He was not reckless in the way that word is usually understood. He was not a gambler or a daredevil or a man intoxicated by danger. He was an engineer. He understood measurement and calculation and the relationship between inputs and outputs better than almost anyone alive. That was his identity. That was his claim to leadership. That was the reason Alfred Nobel trusted him with 65,000 krona, and King Oscar II trusted him with Sweden's reputation, and the Royal Academy trusted him with their endorsement. He was a man of data. And that is exactly what makes this story tragic, rather than merely sad. He was destroyed by ignoring the very thing he worshipped, the measurements, the calculations, the numbers. Ekholm's data was sitting on his desk. It said the balloon would fail, not might fail, would fail. The math was not ambiguous. The leakage rate was not a matter of interpretation. It was a measurement, the kind of clean, quantifiable fact that engineers are trained to respect above all else. And Andrée, the engineer, the rationalist, the man of science, the man who stood before the Royal Academy and argued that Swedish technology could succeed where physical courage had failed, looked at those numbers and chose not to see them. Not because he didn't understand them, because he couldn't afford to. He had Nobel's money. He had the king's endorsement. He had the public's faith. He had made speeches. He had built a hangar on a beach in Svalbard. He had become a symbol not just of an expedition, but of an idea. The idea that Sweden could fly where others walked, that technology could transcend nature, that an engineer with a theory was worth more than an explorer with experience. He could not be wrong, not publicly, not with all of that behind him. The cost of being wrong, the humiliation, the returned money, the newspaper headlines, the look on the faces of the men at the academy was heavier than the cost of proceeding, heavier than the risk, heavier in the end than 3 lives. He didn't fail despite being an engineer. He failed because he stopped being one. He stopped in the one moment when engineering, honest, unflinching, data-driven engineering could have saved everyone. He stopped when the data contradicted the dream. And when the data contradicts the dream, an engineer is supposed to trust the data. That is the first thing they teach you, and it is the first thing that ambition makes you forget. The Arctic did not care about his reasons. The Arctic does not read proposals. It does not weigh prestige. It does not attend presentations at the Royal Academy. It does not distinguish between courage and recklessness, between a man who flies because he genuinely believes and a man who flies because he cannot bear to stay on the ground. It does not know the difference between a hero and a fool, because to the Arctic there is no difference. Both freeze at the same temperature. The ice is still there. Kvitøya is still there, glacier-covered, barren, unreachable most years. A white comma at the edge of the Svalbard archipelago that most maps don't bother to label. The wind still blows across Virgohamna, across the beach where a wooden hangar once stood, and where 530 kilograms of rope once lay coiled on the rocks like a prophecy no one read. The balloon rose. The ropes fell. The silk collected ice gram by gram, hour by hour, with the patience of something that has all the time in the world. The gondola touched the water and rose again and drifted north and east and bounced along the ice and rose again, and then, 65 hours later, did not rise. 3 men walked south on ice that drifted north. They hauled 400 kilograms of supplies over pressure ridges and across open leads and through fog that erased the world. They shot polar bears and ate the meat and felt the warmth of it in their stomachs and did not know that the warmth was a lie. They changed course when the ice wouldn't let them go east. They built a shelter when their legs wouldn't carry them south. They launched a boat when the ice broke apart beneath them. They reached land. They ate. They died. And 33 years later, on a beach that no one visits, on an island that most people have never heard of, in a place so remote that only an accident of ice conditions allowed a ship to approach, a locket was still around a young man's neck, holding the photograph of a woman who had already lived an entire life without him. She was 26 in the photograph. She was 59 when they found it. Andrée did not fail to try. No one, not Ekholm, not Nansen, not the historians who have studied this expedition for a century, has ever questioned his courage. He failed to listen. He failed to stop. He failed to be the engineer he claimed to be, in the one moment when engineering mattered more than ambition, more than prestige, more than the weight of a nation's expectation. He had the data. He had the measurement. He had the truth written in numbers handed to him by a man who had done the work. And he chose the dream instead. The Arctic does not give second chances. It never has. It never will. Thank you for staying until the end of this one. I have a question for you, and I genuinely want to hear your answer. Andrée knew the balloon leaked. Ekholm told him it would fail. He had the data on his desk. He launched anyway. Was that courage, the willingness to go despite the odds? Was it self-destruction, a man who couldn't face the humiliation of retreat? Or was it something else entirely, something we don't have a clean word for? Something between belief and denial, between commitment and entrapment, between leading and falling. And have you ever been too far in to turn back? Have you ever reached a point where the cost of stopping felt worse than the cost of continuing? Even when you knew somewhere, in some quiet part of your mind that you wouldn't let speak out loud, that you were heading toward a wall. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. If this story stayed with you, next week I'm covering an expedition that makes Andrée's look small. The Franklin Expedition of 1845. 129 men sailed into the Arctic aboard 2 of the most advanced ships in the Royal Navy, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, equipped with steam engines, iron-reinforced hulls, 3 years of supplies, the full confidence of the British Admiralty and the greatest maritime empire the world had ever known. Not a single man came home. For over 170 years, the world has been piecing together what happened, and they're still finding answers. In 2014, they found Franklin's flagship HMS Erebus on the Arctic seafloor, and what they discovered inside challenges everything historians believed about how the expedition ended. Subscribe so you don't miss it. If you're new here, this channel covers the moments where human ambition met immovable reality, expeditions that vanished, disasters that unfolded in slow motion, and ventures that collapsed under the weight of the same decisions that launched them. Stories told with the detail they deserve, because the details are where the truth lives. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.